Hello, my name is Maria Bezubova and you're at my channel Fertilizers Jazz. Here we talk about events, trends, technologies in the world of fertilizers and agriculture. Please subscribe to the channel, put like to this video, and let's jazz! Today we will again discuss situation in individual geographical markets, and I'm thrilled to open to you the topic that I think is very important and will to a certain extent form the future of agricultural production and fertilizers market respectively. It is African market. Africa is in the focus of all global agricultural producers, of course, fertilizers producers and other market operators, financial institutions, because of its tremendous potential. This is one, or maybe even the one, place on Earth which still has much of this potential unused, unutilized. Today, I will discuss this potential and current state of fertilizers market with a very interesting guest, Sebastian Nduva, Program Manager for Africa Fertilizer at International Fertilizers Development Center. I am happy to welcome you, Sebastian, and thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Maria. Pleasure to be here.
It's my pleasure indeed. So, Sebastian, let me start with a couple of figures regarding overall potential of African markets, at least what I know. Correct me if I'm wrong, please. In terms of agriculture and respectively fertilizers consumption. All these figures are well known, I think, but still they are really striking when you put them all together. So Africa has about 65% of the world's remaining uncultivated arable land. About 60% of African population is engaged somehow in the agricultural production. On average, African countries are the lucky ones to have about 300 days of annual sunshine, also rich and fertile soils, however, of course, lack of water resources at the same time. And despite having all this, and being so rich in terms of potential and resources, African countries are hugely dependent on the imported food and spend about $65 to $70 billion. I've seen different figures in this respect to purchase it annually. So well-known facts, but still, the potential is definitely impressive. And if we look specifically in the fertilizer segment, again, here the potential is striking. African countries on average use about 22 kilos fertilizers per hectare. Again, correct me if I'm wrong. If we compare it to other countries, like, for example, to my home market, Ukraine, we consume about 75 kilos per hectare. Developed markets like France, we see there even above 150 kilos. US 120, 130 kilos. So the potential is, of course, significant. But of course, the pace of the development in the African markets is uncomparable, much more rapid than elsewhere in the world. So my first question to you would be, what do you think are the key drivers of consumption increase? What should be done, what is done, and what should be done? So is the increase connected, to your opinion, more to organic growth, or rather to some more institutional matters?
Well, thank you very much, Maria, for, I think, framing the numbers and putting them into perspective. By and large, those figures are largely accurate. I will say when we started out tracking the fertilizer space in the African context back in 2006, the average consumption in most countries was 8 kilograms per hectare. But at that time, there was consensus from the head of state in Africa to increase the fertilizer consumption to 50 kilograms per hectare by 2015. Fast forward to current situations, we do have varying degrees of usage across the different countries. But the accurate figure, as far as we can tell from the markets that we've been tracking, is around 34 kilograms per hectare. So there has been progress, but the progress in itself is not at the rate that we would like it to be. If you compare this to the global average of around 134 kilograms per hectare, a lot needs to be done. Now, having said that, the positive or silver lining in all this is that we are seeing a situation where the rate of consumption increase in the continent is at 12% per annum. So that's an unprecedented rate. I think currently right now, the next leading is around 3%. So there is a lot of positivity in the direction that the fertilizer markets are experiencing. Just before the COVID crisis back in 2020, we were starting to see an organic growth in the consumption patterns of fertilizer, largely driven by an appreciation by farmers on the importance of the usage of fertilizer. Now, this came about as a result of, I think, varying degrees of interventions from various organizations, development partners such as IFDC, working collaboratively with governments across Africa, as well as the private sector, all led to a situation where farmers were appreciating the consumption of fertilizer. But over the last 4 years, I think we've seen a lot of hitches around fertilizer consumption. Post COVID, we started seeing geopolitical tensions in Eastern Europe. We also saw import restriction quotas from China and Russia, no doubt very important sources of fertilizer for the African market. So that in itself did stifle consumption numbers. And through that, we started seeing state-led interventions in the form of emergency subsidies, um, um, provision of fertilizer on rebated basis from some of the private sector companies. But I see going forward a slight resumption somewhat in normal consumption patterns. And we expect over the next 5 years the consumption trend to go back to where it was before 2020.
I see. I see. Yeah, let's hope that the whole, world will come back to on track, so to say, and hopefully it really will happen very soon. And moving, let's say, to the current situation in the market, what is your view upon demand for the fertilizers in the African countries today, let's say 2024? Obviously, the year is very difficult for many markets due to various reasons like extreme weather conditions influencing crops, specifically in Southern Europe dramatically, low crops prices, and at the same time, high fertilizers prices. So what is the pace of development this year? How do you see it?
I'm actually a bit optimistic for 2024. 2022, 2023 specifically were extremely difficult years for most African markets in terms of fertilizer, largely driven by fiscal issues. So we saw countries having extremely limited forex reserves to ensure procurement of fertilizer. And why is that important, if you may ask? Now, Africa is a net importer of fertilizer. We basically rely over 90% of all our fertilization requirements from external sources. So not having adequate forex reserves puts a damper in how much and how fast we can actually turn around a procurement of fertilizer into the continent. But 2024 has seen, I think, a positive shift, especially in the markets that we track. Now, having said that, we are covering around 25 markets in the African context out of around 55 countries in totality. So we are starting to see the benefits of softer CFR prices being then passed on inherently to the farmers. So that in itself has seen a resurgence in demand in some markets. We are seeing Ethiopia growing large volumes of its NP and urea requirements. We're seeing markets like Tanzania exponentially growing in terms of how much fertilizer is being consumed. In West Africa, we've seen countries like Cote d'Ivoire, countries like Ghana having very healthy appetite from the farmers to use fertilizers. So 2024, in as much as we have bits and pieces of mixed signals from different countries, overall, I think it's a positive trend. And I think status quo going into 2025, should the fiscal issues then be resolved, we should see a resurgence of healthy demand from farmers.
That's good to hear that at least some markets around the globe are feeling more or less okay. Because, for example, in Southern Europe, the situation, including Ukraine, obviously, apart from the war, but just the situation in the agricultural sector is really, really tough because of the droughts, because of the heat waves, with influencing fertilizer consumption. So good to hear that someone at least is going more or less well. Interestingly that you mentioned, and actually I wanted to elaborate more on this. You mentioned that Africa is a net importer of fertilizer, but at the same time, we know very well that Africa is also one of the large maybe not the largest, but the large producers and exporters of fertilizer. So nitrogen and phosphate producers are from Africa, are very, very important in the international scene. They export their products globally, and they, to a certain extent, form, the situation in the international markets. So how do you see the cooperation between these producing countries and countries which are dependent from imports within the continent? What is the situation in that right now?
Quite an interesting situation and scenario, one that I'm always passionately discussing with the main producing countries in Africa. Now, for example, if you take case in point Nigeria, or most West African countries that are net suppliers of N-based products, they will normally tend to seek higher profit netbacks from Latin America, Brazil, etc. If you look at the pea producing markets in Northern Africa, likewise, they will also tend to look at higher CFR netbacks. So where does that leave the rest of Africa, especially Sub-Saharan Africa? So that's a conversation that we are very passionately lobbying for, because we are wanting to see a situation, an ideal situation where countries that have net surplus of production or produce fertilizer within their own geographies, it only makes sense for those countries to then inherently trade with the neighboring countries within Africa. But that for a very long time has been hindered by tariff and non-tariff barriers, where we're seeing it's an extremely expensive business decision to transact across borders. We had seen for example, if I take East Africa, getting product from Middle East into the ports of East Africa is essentially cheaper than clearing the product and moving it inland. So such issues need to be addressed. And I think as Africa then looks to operationalize the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, that such bottlenecks are then addressed. Because if you ask me, I think it's ridiculous getting product. Landed cost is cheaper than clearing it and transacting it further downstream to our farmers. So if the continent can then, I think, exhaustively address these tariff and non-tariff barriers, we would see a situation where then fertilizers are freely traded. As IFDC, I remember back when the crisis started out in 2021, 2022, we had to extensively engage with the private sector in Nigeria to ensure that urea then infiltrated further up into Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, etc. So that's a situation, if you ask me, that I really want supported going forward, and especially in the backdrop of the recently concluded Africa Union Fertilizer and Soil Health Summit. So one of the resolutions was actually to triple domestic production of fertilizer, with mechanisms put in place to ensure that fertilizer flows freely across borders in the African context.
Indeed, I think it's a very, very important initiative that will really help to reach that goal and to increase the demand in those countries which still, struggled how to get them inland. That's definitely a very important initiative. And if we zoom a bit more into the specific markets, let's say market segments, which fertilizer segments are most important for the African farmers now, as you see it? So is consumption focused on the basic products, like, for example, nitrogen or maybe basic NPKs? Or there are already markets which are looking into some more, more modern products like specialty products, water-soluble fertilizers, etc., etc. What is your opinion?
Yeah, so for a very long time, and I think this is still current reality, most African markets are denominated by traditional or straight fertilizer, compound fertilizers. So we have markets that are heavily reliant on the DAPs, heavily reliant on the basic nitrogens, like you call them, the ureas, the CANs. We are seeing, in a very positive manner, very steady growth in the NPK segments, where we are seeing countries now starting to adopt bespoke fertilizer formulations for their own fertilization requirements. Case in point, again, back in Nigeria, back in 2018, when there was a blanket ban on importation of finished NPKs, we saw an exponential growth in the blending market from around a handful of blenders, 9 of them, to now over 80%, 80 blending facilities in the country. So I think that's a testament to if favorable policies are actually put in place, coupled with extensive knowledge transfer and extension services, I think farmers do understand and appreciate the importance of using more modern fertilizer types and formulations. So going forward, we are closely tracking how this NPK segment grows. But to respond to your question, as it stands currently, most markets are largely driven by the traditional fertilizers.
Which is logical because, of course, fertilizer is a matter of the price. And when you are limited in your financial resource, there is no other choice. When I talk to producers of specialty fertilizers, specifically water-soluble fertilizers across the globe, the first thing what they say in terms of their business orientation and future goals is penetrate African market in a correct way and as soon as possible. Because everyone understands very clearly that the potential, not only potential physical, as we already discussed, but also because of the climate and because of the lack of the water resources, that is one of the places on Earth, or the one place on Earth, which really is the right place for the specialty fertilizers. Have you seen already a lot of companies, a lot of efforts? I understand that this market is very niche, of course, still, but have you seen already many companies and efforts to penetrate at least key African markets, and how do you see it moving forward?
Yeah, so there are bits and pieces or pockets of where these specialty fertilizers do apply. Largely in the floriculture industry, we are seeing countries like Kenya, countries like Ethiopia that are leading in floriculture production. We're also seeing countries that are leading in horticultural production, especially for export bound produce, slowly adopting and appreciating the importance of these water soluble or niche fertilizer types. But having said that, I think the biggest bottleneck is still largely driven by our cultural practices. What I mean by that is that if you look at most African nations, staples is the only thing to grow, right? So if you're relying on staples and you're only relying on traditional fertilizers, the narrative ends there. But as we diversify, I think our produce, what is then required both for local consumption as well as for exports, in tandem, we then inherently then encourage the consumption of these specialty products. Now, having said that, they also do come with a premium price, one that I think farmers are still not willing to pay for. So it's still going to take a lot of intervention at various levels to incentivize farmers to adopt these specialty fertilizers.
Do you see some maybe already institutional discussions about that, or still not, or still it's far from there?
So that is still at infancy stages. So organizations such as ourselves um, uh, obviously work with private sector partners to carry out formulation testing. We do in situ field trials just to prove efficacy and incentivize the farmers to see the results for themselves, and hopefully that snowballs into adoption. But at the moment, this is still an infancy sector, a very niche sector, one that is only geared towards high value production for export oriented crops.
I see. Thank you. We already touched a bit on that, but I would like again to elaborate a bit more. There are plenty, obviously, of challenges on the way of consumption increase, but which ones, to your opinion, are the key ones? What is that? Lack of knowledge, financing, or what are those?
Now, if you look at how fertilizer is traded in the African context, most traders, most producers supplying product into Africa view Africa as a very risky market. And I'm not shy to say this because I was on that other side as well. So credit ratings, especially for most African countries, really does um, uh, deals a blow in terms of how countries are then able to procure fertilizers. If you look at most country ratings where fertilizer is traded, the traders will obviously, and in most cases, put a risk premium just to safeguard late payments, to safeguard deferred payments in most instances. So the main challenge, I think, is fiscal in nature. If that could be addressed, I think we can then incentivize flow of fertilizers. And one way of doing that is perhaps through trade credit guarantee schemes, through the African Development Bank, as we've seen in some of the countries in Africa. That in itself passes the risk and actually spreads it across the different actors within that value chain. The other one I would say, I think, is lack of knowledge in terms of utilization of fertilizer. This has grown over time, but the extension service, I think the extension sector in Africa needs to be overhauled, and there needs to be a deliberate rethink of how we then structure our extension services. Ethiopia, for example, is slowly becoming a net self-reliant on wheat, largely driven by a very robust extension system. So if this could then be replicated across different African countries, I think it makes the learning curve a bit shorter and ensure that farmers have the knowledge on proper fertilizer utilization. The other one I think I've already mentioned, distributing product inland in terms of infrastructure. We're seeing issues with port congestion. If you go to Beira Port, we're seeing traders and manufacturers preferring to use other discharge ports, largely by the inefficiencies around turnaround times of vessels, and also the infrastructure, basic infrastructure of getting the product inland, in some instances results in expensive product ultimately landing on the farmer's side.
I see. Yes, that's very right, and that's are really significant challenges. So, how do you evaluate how long it should take in order really to overcome these major barriers, at least to boom the consumption, to help the countries to boom the consumption?
Yeah, so over the last 3 years, again, on the backdrop of the crisis that we witnessed in the African context, we saw various interventions both at continental and regional level, just trying to stimulate uptake and distribution of fertilizer within these countries. So I would say one, if the industry then collaborates to ensure that farmers receive fertilizers at a near affordable price level, I think that could be one way of incentivizing adoption of fertilizer. Two, if you can have very robust financing mechanism, either through assured financial instruments to sort of render confidence to the suppliers of fertilizer within the African space, that will in itself help alleviate some of these issues that you're facing. Again, if you can then, to some extent, be self-reliant on meeting of fertilization requirements within the continent, I think that will go a long way, because as it stands right now, the continent is extremely exposed to whatever happens globally. So if there's a slight shift in prices, in availability of fertilizer, that inherently has a very direct correlation to what happens in Africa. So if you can solve those basic issues, I think it will be a step in the right direction, and hopefully get to surpass these targets of 50 kg per hectare that we set for ourselves over 15 years ago.
Indeed, indeed. And one more question that I'm very interested in, I already mentioned, obviously Africa lacks water resource, which is very, very important resource in combined with fertilizers in order to increase the agricultural production. Maybe you can name a couple of projects which help to solve this problem now in different African countries. Are there some? Do you see this moving?
Well, your statement holds true in some geographies, but in others, I beg to disagree. Because if you look at how we manage our water resources, I don't think it's the most efficient way, because from time to time we do have extremely high rainfall levels, but this is not tapped. This is not stored for future usage in terms of then using it for irrigation services. So if we can sort that out, I think that in itself opens up bigger cropland areas that are then irrigated to ensure year-long and year-round production of viable crops within the continent. Now, having said that, I think nutrient use efficiency is more an issue than a water resource management, because I don't believe that nutrient use efficiency has been optimized in the African context. I think if we then find frameworks and programs around which We then train our farmers to optimize whatever fertilizers we're using. In the short term, that in itself could render 20% yield increases, as opposed to just relying on water as a resource by itself.
I see. Thank you very much. I want to thank you, Sebastian, for your time and for this highly insightful discussion. I'm sure it is insightful not only for me, but for everyone who is listening. And I'm happy to uncover, this topic. Of course, I would like to regularly track this topic further, and I will be more than glad to host you more and to go more deep into certain questions that we just, touched very, very swiftly today. Thank you again for your time, and I wish you all the best.
Yeah, thank you for having us, and I think we're open to sharing our experiences as far as Africa is concerned. Thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian. Thank you for watching. As usually, I will leave all credentials of Sebastian and IFDC in the comments below the video. Please let me know in the comments which other questions related to the African market you would like me to cover, and I will be glad to invite Sebastian and other market operators to do so. Please subscribe to the channel, put like to this video, and see you soon.